Good morning, everyone. I was reflecting on this subject of light and also touching on the aspect of the healing power of light. In the very early years of being on the spiritual path, thinking back now to when I was in my early 20s and living at Ananda village with a group of women, and we used to meditate together every morning, and often in the course of those years, not really fully understanding the implications of things, I at least sometimes did things that were not wise. We used to, every morning we would do healing prayers after we finished our group meditation, and we had a list of names of people that we would pray for. We still follow the same practices. It was something that Paramahansa Yogananda initiated, and he had a little formula for how you recite the prayer, and then you visualize people and you rub your hands together and raise your arms, and then there's more extended ways of doing it. It's all in itself a wonderful practice, which you can learn here if you're interested in doing so. But I, just being a verbal person, it came to this certain part, and I said, manifest your healing energy, light, and joy in everyone's body, mind, and soul. So we would all pray, manifest your energy, light, and joy. And then we would say the prayer and we'd rub our hands like this. And being a person who often spoke in public, gradually as time passed, I began to realize that all over Ananda people were saying, manifest your energy, light, and joy. And it just seemed perfectly nice. And about 25 or 30 years later, I happened to be reading something that Master had written. And what Master actually said is, manifest your healing presence. Divine Mother, manifest your healing presence. Healing presence in body, mind, and soul. And then it went on to explain that there's a very subtle and extremely real spiritual principle there, which is where there is light, no darkness can dwell. When I had just casually shifted it to manifest your energy, light, and joy, just thought, well, here I am, and I want more of your brightness. Come into me. And having no idea what a subtle philosophical and spiritual relationship I was monkeying with by just substituting one phrase for another. And I quickly, thank God for email, sent emails to everyone I could think of in the world saying, you may not realize this, but it's I who aberrated this prayer because I have a vivid memory of things like that. Please, let's go back to what Master actually wanted. And for the most part, not everyone had shifted over, but it's one of those just little things. Like in the Bible, somebody reads that Jesus said, if thine eye be single, thy whole body will be full of light. And some translator says, well, what could that possibly mean? Not understanding, meditating at the spiritual eye, closing your eyes to the duality of the world, seeing the one presence of spirit, transcending the outwardness of the senses, seeing the light as it emanates from inside. So the translator says, if your eyes are sound, if your eyes are clear, not having any idea how subtle the original is and how completely other it becomes just by these little shifts. Now, I don't want in this sense to make us paranoid, but it pays to respect what we don't understand. Now, that simple principle, manifest thy healing presence. What's so fascinating about Master's teachings, Yogananda's teachings as Swami Kriyananda expressed them, is you can pick them up from almost any angle, and you'll gradually, if you go deeply enough into that point, you can discover almost everything else. I myself like to study. I like to hear the same ideas expressed in new ways. I like to stay right within Yogananda and Swamiji's teaching, but still, he's written 100 books, and I've read them all. And I go back and read them again, because sometimes you understand it this way, sometimes you understand it that way. But this concept of healing presence, and where there is the presence of God, no darkness can dwell. In today's reading, Marilyn just touched on a phrase. Swamiji didn't tell the whole story. He simply says, a saint who was healed by the divine light was told by God, where my light is, no darkness can dwell. And that story, as Swamiji tells it elsewhere more completely, was a man whose body was completely broken with disease. He may have had diabetes or something like that. And he just saw the end of his life coming, the end of his life in that body, and he decided at least he would do what he could between now and the time that he exited the body to make as much spiritual progress as possible. So he would meditate as long as he could meditate. Sometimes it would be 10 minutes, sometimes 15 minutes, before the demands of the body would cause him to have to stop. And each time he would just push it just as far as he could, and then he would have to give up. And he never prayed to God to be healed. He wasn't asking for any particular outcome. In fact, his prayer, as Swamiji described it, was so touching. He said, "Lord," the man prayed, "come into my broken temple." And gradually his focus became entirely on his meditation. And then one day he realized that his broken temple, his physical body, was no longer broken. And that was when he prayed to God and said, "Lord, I never asked you to heal me." But then inwardly the divine spoke to him and said, "Yes, but if I am present, no darkness can dwell." Now, it's not true in all cases that physical healing is the result of divine attunement. Sometimes the incarnation is over. No physical body lasts forever unless it's a special dispensation like Babaji, and then it's done consciously by divine will. But for most of us, we inhabit our body for a long or a short period of time, and then we've used it up. A friend of ours who was afflicted with AIDS, which at the time she had it, she was an earlier case of that, and the drugs that can control that difficulty were just coming in. They were more experimental, and she had quite a few very difficult years. And in the course of the cycle of having AIDS, and even prior to that, she'd had several experiences in which she'd left her body completely, seen the heavenly realms, realized it wasn't her time to go. When I say heavenly realms, I mean the astral worlds, the world beyond the physical. She saw that world. She realized that death was just a very simple transition. All fear of death left her, but in that astral world, it was clear to her that she wasn't finished with the incarnation here, so she came back. So she found herself with no fear of death whatsoever, and no anxiety about leaving this world. She didn't have young children or anybody that would be left behind. But it was just a question. And then, in order to stay in her body with the affliction of AIDS that she had to work very hard at it. She had to take a complex regimen of drugs. She had to do a lot of affirmations and healing and dietary things. And it took a lot of willpower for her to stay in her body. So she asked Swami Kriyananda the obvious question, why? Is it worth it? At what point do I just say this is just too much trouble? It's a very profound question. Swami's answer was, well, if you were going to be fully liberated from the necessity from all material return, if you have no more karma on the material plane, and when you shed this body you will merge into the light, well then, of course, anytime you go, there's no loss in that. And she didn't dispute that that was not likely. If that had been the case, she wouldn't have been asking him the question to begin with. But he said, so the probability is that after this incarnation you will have another one. And since incarnations start with infancy, you can face that long cycle of all the things that you have to learn as an infant. Then you have to go through being a toddler. Then you have to learn to read. Then you have to be an adolescent. And gradually you find your spiritual path, and you have to sort it out with all your family. He said, all just to bring you to the point where you are now, where you're a disciple, where you can practice Kriya, where you know your spiritual path, where you have your spiritual family. He said, why bother? He said, just keep this body, he said, as long as you can, as long as it doesn't make attunement with God impossible. As long as you can practice meditation to some extent, or at least God remembrance, as long as you can feel that within that physical frame you are still able to continually attune yourself to God, at the point at which the body becomes too much of a problem, then just let it go. It's a very interesting question. But you see, what it's also answering is, what is the purpose of life? Lahiri Mahashaya, Saint Shukdev was his name. Lahiri quoted it. All time is wasted, he said, that is not spent seeking God. Well, considering the demands that life placed upon us of working and raising families and taking care of our physical bodies. I was just doing laundry yesterday. We had a lot of house guests during the time that we were away. Well, we always have a lot of house guests. We call it Hotel Praver, actually. We put people down in the reservation book, and so there's always all this laundry going through, and it's not like it's uncongenial work. You just wash it, and you fold it, and you put it away, then you take it out, and you use it, and then you wash it, and you fold it, and you put it away, and you take it out, and you use it, and you make food, and you wash the dishes, and then you put the food away, and then you wash the dishes. I mean, it just goes on, and sometimes you just wish to, well, you basically wish to walk away from the whole thing and just become like those renunciates who live on nothing. It isn't exactly what God is calling me personally to do, so there's little hope of it. But just the sheer, just simple necessity of taking care of our physical bodies, and that doesn't even take into account earning a living or doing your taxes or all those things. There's just this constancy, isn't there, of responsibilities that we can't renounce until essentially they renounce us, until we have really transcended that level of reality, and that they fall away of themselves, is how I would say, that the world supports you completely differently without your having to put forth that effort. And if you're there, you'll know it. So in the meantime, we have this really serious problem, which is how not to waste all our time, how not to always be just doing something that when our life is over, and we have that perspective that's given to us in that transition when we have the final exam, as Swamiji calls it, which is death itself. We get to find out how much we've really learned. We get to review it from the astral plane and see it as a totality. How much have we really done of what we came here to do? Now, it's all contained in this simple thought of the healing presence of God, of the presence of light eradicating effortlessly all of the rest of what's going on. This is the simple image that the masters use over and over again. Though a room be in darkness for thousands of years, as soon as you bring in the light, then the darkness is as if it never were. I remember a vivid moment. It's just a childhood moment, but somehow it's one of those thoughts that in its complete mundaneness always seemed to have a spiritual implication for me. I was a very small child, I don't know, 3 or 4 years old, and my father was a big man, over 6 feet tall and a bit heavy set like this. And one night, it was like the middle of the night, and I got up probably to go into the bathroom. And I went out and I was standing in the hallway. And for some reason, my father was also up in the night. And it was one of those internal hallways in our house where no light penetrates at all. So it was pitch black. And not wanting to wake the family, he hadn't switched any light on. And my father's walking along, and all of a sudden he feels under his bare feet my little tiny bare foot. And I can still just remember the feeling of his little foot his big foot coming onto my tiny one. And suddenly I'm about an inch away from him like this. I had no fear of my father, but neither of us expected the other to be there. Interestingly, I didn't make any noise at all. Or maybe I went, but I didn't scream or anything. And then he reached over and he turned on the light. And this unexpected reality for both of us was just revealed. Me in my little jammies, I'm about up to here on him at that point, and him standing above me. He never seemed larger ever in my life as he did then. But you see, isn't that what we're like? We're these little children, and we're living in the land of shadow. Sometimes some interpretations of the Bible say the land of death. And what death represents is the idea that everything that we've committed ourselves to that is not eternal, that makes us living in the land of death. All of the values and the happiness and the attachments that we form that we think are our lasting happiness, but sooner or later are going to be dissolved. If not sooner, when we exit this body and everything that's been defined by having it, all of our relations, all of our positions. When my father was in the last days of his life, he lived in a retirement facility, and there were many other people there, of course. And I was so struck by How many people in their last years surround themselves with all the accoutrements of their earlier life? The children, the grandchildren, the great-grandchildren, the graduation of the great-grandchild, the uncle, the aunt, like this, and they're just sitting in this room full of attachments. And everyone thinks, isn't that wonderful? Look at all their attachments. Holding on here to the last possible breath. Whereas the ideal of sannyas from the Indian side is at the end you just walk away from it all. I mean, in the traditional society, before you died, you walked away from it all. You just went out into the forest and prepared yourself just to let it go. Because otherwise, if you die with all these thoughts in your minds of my house, my family, my son, my husband, my child, my this, my that, then you go out of this body and the light tries to come into you and expand your awareness from all this limitation and take you into the land of everlasting bliss, and you can't go. Because my house, my child, my son, my husband, you have to hold on to it, or even my body, whatever it might be. That's the final exam that Swami speaks about. So the practice that we need to bring into our lives right now is such a simple one. And this is what happens to intellectually educated, sophisticated people, and I will just collectively say like us. This particular part of the world is a joy to live in, because it is extremely sophisticated and refined and intellectually subtle and creative. And I mean, there's a 1,000 positive things you can say. But that's the good news, that there's energy here and creativity and imagination, and people know how to do things, and we're caught up in that flow, which we can also apply to the spiritual path. But the difficulty is, we get confused about how really simple this is. The relationship with the divine is a very simple love affair. That's all it is. In our community now, there's among the many children, there's a woman who has a little one about this big. He's about 5 months old. He's named after a great sage. He's a great soul. He's just one of those absolutely magnetic babies. I mean, many babies are magnetic and some are super magnetic. This is a super magnetic baby. And even I, who have no wish to have a child, and thank God every day I never did, look at this baby and just think, you just want him to be yours. And even just meeting him every once in a while, my mind still goes back to him. He's just so dear, and who knows, it's just karma. Maybe he's somebody I've known in the past, who knows. My mind keeps going back to him. And I look at his dear mother, and I think there's probably not a single moment of her life, waking or sleeping, since that child came in, that she's not thinking of him. She doesn't have to discipline herself to do it. She can't prevent herself from doing it. And why does she do that? Because of the sheer bliss of thinking of those eyes, of having those little arms around her, of holding that soft form to her chest, of being responsible for this little baby. It's motherhood and parenthood, and the adorableness of small children is given to us so that we will understand selfless love. Because it's not having children, with all due respect, that really means anything. I mean, cats and rats and dogs and cows can all produce babies. It's nothing particularly skillful. In fact, a lot of people accidentally produce babies. They don't even really mean to do it. And then, wow, there's a baby, So in and of itself, it doesn't mean anything. But spiritually speaking, the symbology of that, and we often refer to it, because after all, we call God Divine Mother. Why are we calling God Divine Mother? Because we're describing from the other side what it feels like. Just as that woman in our community is so beautiful in her devotion to her child, it's just the tiniest little hint of the way Divine Mother loves us. I mean, she loves that baby because the baby was in her womb. It's her child. It's her responsibility. As Master says, a woman loves her baby so deeply, and if that baby dies, she mourns and mourns. But if that same child is born across the street, she doesn't pay any attention to him. It's the egoic identity that gives us that commitment. But Divine Mother's commitment to us is unconditional. But what about our commitment to her? How much do we even notice how Divine Mother is taking care of us? Or are we, like those little children, just absolutely oblivious? Little children just expect you all the time to take care of them. There was a little girl who's now a grown woman who was a baby in our community, and she was one of those children. It took her about 2 years, I think, to realize that she was not an old woman anymore. She just kept in her child face this look of an imperious old woman. I think she'd been a wealthy, probably solitary, extremely unpleasant old woman in her previous lifetime, and she died and just kept that thought form. Managed to get herself into a baby's body, but never really gave in to that concept, just held this thought and was constantly a little annoyed. And I said to her parents once, I said, she looks like an imperious woman who wants to know why the servants are late with the tea. And then a while later I said, months later, I said, she doesn't look like that so much anymore. She doesn't look like she's waiting for the servants anymore. And the father said, that's because she's found them, her mother and me. But in our lives, absolutely everything is provided to us by our loving mother. Here's one breath, exhale. Where does the second breath come from? Why is there a second breath? Why do we even know how to breathe? I'm always so moved when, as happened occasionally, somebody in our spiritual family leaves his body very suddenly. The husband of a friend of mine went out running. He went out running, he was running. He said to the man he was running with, I don't feel very well. And he sat down and left his body, just like that. Another woman's friend, the man got up in the middle of the night. He stepped into the bathroom, but he actually stepped into the astral world. He was in his physical body on this side. He stepped onto that side, and his time was up. Because Divine Mother gives us our breath, and when it's over, she takes it back. We're so horrified. But as Krishna says to Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita, because Arjuna was complaining about having to be a soldier and kill the people, the other enemies. Isn't that wrong, he said? Krishna said, your vision is so limited. He said, you think that they die. He said, I see that their bodies fall over and their spirits rise. He says, what is there to mourn in that? Everything in this world just comes and goes and comes and goes and gets given to us by Divine Mother. In our elementary school here, in the elementary school part of it, Barbara Rabin brought in this practice, which is a beautiful practice, multi-dimensions. One of it, you go in there and you see these charts. Choose happiness, practice kindness. And you have all the list of the children in the class, and every child has exactly the same number of stickers, marking every time they've been correct. And you think, well, I guess we don't want to, quote, hurt the self-esteem of any child. And when I asked Barbara about it, she explained to me that it's really quite a very different practice. It's not about, I did the right thing, I get rewarded. Instead, she said, what it is the children practice observing acts of kindness around them. They practice observing times when children choose happiness. And they have another practice which is similar called rocks in the basket. Every time something positive, worth noting happens, whether it's the action of an individual or the class or some sort of great glorious moment in time, a child can come to the teacher and say, I think this merits putting a rock in the basket. And then they gradually fill up the basket, and when the basket is full of these tangible signs of positive action, then they have a big celebration. Now, when Barbara was talking to me about this, she was pointing out to me what you see if you think of it. What they're training the children to do is to observe the positive in life. You see? Observe the times when positive energy is flowing. Now, at all times, there's always a duality going on. And what we see in this world is not really what is in this world. What we see in this world is what we have trained our consciousness habitually to observe. And oftentimes things are very, very difficult. One of my friends who actually was in the hospital and died shortly after that, he'd always been kind of cynical about sentimental things and very much of a New Yorker in that respect. He just didn't have any, he's from New York, and he was very New Yorkish about these things, kind of a curmudgeon is the word I would use. He said he was sick in the hospital and a lot of people brought flowers into him. And he said, I'll never be cynical about that again. He would lie in the hospital bed, very weak, often in pain, with really not many choices. But there would be those flowers. And because everything was so slowed down for him and there was really very little else to do, he suddenly became profoundly conscious of the nature of a flower and the life force and the pure selfless giving of a flower. I mean, the flower just makes itself beautiful and then just stands out there for you for a very short period of time, and then it just slips out of its life. Yogananda wrote one of his Whispers from Eternity, Doorways Everywhere. And he says, I looked at this world and I saw nothing. And then I attuned my inner consciousness to the healing presence of the light, to the uplifting power of the divine, to the unconditional love of the mother. And then he said, I see doors everywhere. That's the simplicity of the spiritual path. Do we look at this world and see the duality of matter with the two eyes? Or do we look at this world and see the singularity of spirit with the healing presence of the light? We live in the land of the shadows, and unto us is given if we choose to receive it. I'm not talking about just the descent of Christ in the form of Jesus. I mean, unto us is given, for those of us who lift up our hearts and consciousness to see it, unto us is given the light.